Hi, Ida here. So this is what happens. I'm out walking with my dog and I just let my thoughts roam around freely, and I get these really great ideas about things I want to talk about, and I think about it and what I want to say and how I want to say it. But because I'm out walking with my dog and it's not a completely conscious process, I'm not taking any notes, I'm not, recording it in any way. So then I get home and I try to remember what I'm saying when I turn on the camera. So this is kind of why sometimes these things get a bit rambly and seem very badly prepared, because they are. I'm basically just trying to remember what my point is most of the time. And so that's what's gonna happen today too. Today I wanted to talk a bit about the intersection between spirituality and the natural sciences, because I'm a big fan of science, and for me, as someone who has a very nature-oriented spirituality and very earth-based spirituality, natural science becomes part of that, because that is one way of looking at nature and one way of looking at one way of looking at the world. For me, nature and the processes in this very physical and this very material world, they are sacred. This world is sacred and divine, and so natural science becomes one way of exploring this sacred thing. And I find it very, I don't know what, like, I really enjoy it. I really enjoy that way of approaching it, because sometimes spirituality can become very abstract. You have all these very abstract concepts and ideas, and sometimes that is difficult to relate to that in your everyday life and to really understand it and grasp it. For instance, the whole idea of everyone being a part of a greater whole, and everyone having their own place in the world. That sounds great, but it can sometimes be a bit difficult to really relate to. Sorry. But if you look at it from a perspective of natural science, you can make it more concrete and more tangible, and sort of a bit more easy perhaps to understand. For instance, I'm going to use air as an example in this video, because it's something that's pretty easy to explain, and in particular oxygen, because that is one of the ways in which we are connected with everything else, and one of the ways in which we are interdependent with other creatures in the in the world. Yeah. And so the air, if we look at it, I think everyone, or at least almost everyone who is witch or pagan, or at least familiar with the concept of the four elements, I think that originated with the Greeks. And it's this idea that everything consists of four elements, which are air, water, earth, and fire. And you can look at it from a spiritual point of view, but you can also look at it from a rather sort of material and scientific point of view. With air, for instance, air is all around us. It's right here. We can't air we can't really actually see and feel, but you know, we know it's there and we need it to survive. Anyone who has, you know, choked on a piece of food at some point know how very important air is. And air consists of, mainly from a, you know, point of view of natural science, you can have these ideas too, that it also relates to the mind and so on, and I'll touch on that a bit later. But from a natural science point of view, air is mostly nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and all these other gases. And we need it for breathing. And what happens is, and this is the way in which we are sort of all part of a greater whole, is that plants create oxygen. They do that in the cells, in the green parts of the plants, mostly the leaves. They have chlorophyll. I forgot what that was called, which is a bit embarrassing. Chlorophyll. What happens is that they use the energy from the sun, and they take carbon dioxide and water, and with the help of the energy from the sun, they turn that into glucose, which is kind of a sugar, and oxygen. And the glucose they use themselves. That is how they get their energy to grow, and all the processes in the cells that keep them alive. The oxygen, most of it they don't really use themselves. They use some of it, but most of it they just release into the air, and that is how we get oxygen in the air. And this is not just like big plants like trees and flowers. This is also some bacteria do it, small algae do it in the oceans, and so on. And then what happened is, we need oxygen to survive, because that is how we get access to the energy that our bodies need. So we breathe in that oxygen, it goes down into our lungs, and from the lungs it's transferred to our bloodstream, and you know, it travels with the blood into each of our little cells. And in the cell, we take this oxygen and we take glucose, which we get when we eat, you know, for plants, for instance. And oxygen and glucose we use in our bodies to produce water and carbon dioxide, and we get energy from that. That is how the human body, and all bodies basically, there are some exceptions among the microbes, but for the most part, that is how we get our energy. We use glucose and oxygen, and we split that into carbon dioxide and water, and the energy that we get from that is stored in other molecules. And then we breathe out the carbon dioxide and the water, and that is how carbon dioxide ends up in the air, because living, breathing creatures, as well as plants, release that into the air. And so that carbon dioxide then in turn is needed by the plants to produce oxygen that we need to survive. So there is this big cycle there, and this big exchange between us and all other living creatures, in terms of oxygen and carbon dioxide. which I think is really rather cool. And this is just one example. There is also this big beautiful cycle where water is moved around, which I'll probably to make a video about at some point. And as I also touched upon the whole how energy is moved around in the form of glucose, for instance, and comes from the sun and all that. So we're all this part of this big process of just sort of shifting molecules from one place to the other, and this constant exchange of molecules. And it's this constant exchange, this constant shifting around of elements, that is what keeps all of us alive. That's not just what keeps us alive, that's what keeps the trees alive, that's what keeps the animals alive. And so that is a very, very tangible way in which we really are part of a greater whole, that we can use if we're having trouble like really grasping this whole big spiritual ideas. We can use the natural world because it's all there, very obvious. We can see it, we can touch it. And yeah, and then so I think that the whole idea, I mean, modern people, we tend to look at the model with the 4 elements as wrong, because we know now that there are atoms and all. It's not really all built, it's not really in the way we've been taught in school. The world is not really made up of air and water and fire and earth, because it's built up of atoms. But I mean, if you think about it, these are 4 very sort of very important, they're like the cornerstones of life on earth here anyway, because the air is one of these mediums through which this exchange takes place, and so is the water. And the water is also a molecule which is very important, which is no, as far as I know, no life on earth can survive without water. And the earth itself, of course, is, I mean, it's the whole foundation of our existence. The earth as a planet, but also the things that are going on in the soil and the elements that are there that we need to build up our bodies, and the fire, of course, in terms of the sun, or at the center of the earth, that energy and that heat that we also really, really need to be able to survive. So I think there's still a lot of merit to that model with the 4 elements, and I think it's a very useful model for explaining how the world works. And you can also sort of, as I think I touched on before, you can also add to this and think of it in terms of other associations, where you might associate air with our mind, or water with our emotions, and it can be a very useful psychological model too in that sense. But I really like to keep this very down-to-earth perspective too in my spirituality, and actually, you know, really look at the things that we really can see, the material world. I don't like the whole ignoring the material world and just focus on the spiritual. That is very, like, the parts that we can't see and can't really perceive with our ordinary senses. I mean, it's there too. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong, but with focusing on that, I just feel that I find it very enriching to also not forget, you know, the material world, because that is sort of where my body is, and that is what I need to relate to in my everyday life. And yeah, and I like, you know, this, when you have this approach, you also get this perspective that, you know, nature is, because we're so dependent on it, it's sacred, it's awe-inspiring, because it's fantastic when you start looking into how things work and how things are connected. It's absolutely wonderful and it's beautiful. And also it can inform your lifestyle in also very tangible ways, and not just spiritual principles, because now you know, if you know what air does in the natural world from a scientific point of view, you know that you'll need clean air, because if there's a lot of crap in the air, like a lot of pollution, a lot of molecules that don't belong there, that's going to affect, first of all, it's going to affect how much or little sunlight comes through, and that affects the plants, that affects their ability to produce oxygen, and it and also, if there's a lot of shit in the air and we breathe in that air because we need to, that's going to damage our lungs, because then there ends up a lot of things in the lungs that don't belong there, and it's going to damage them. And that's when we end up with, you know, bronchitis and lung cancer and what's it called in English? Never mind, all these diseases where your lungs get ruined and you can't breathe properly, and then your body can't function and you might eventually die. So it's important to look, to not just ignore the physical aspects of this world, because it's all yeah, it's interconnected. That is part of spirituality too, if you ask me. This world is you know, spirit incarnate. This is the gods. This is spirit. This is sacred. And we need to treat that with respect. Yeah. If you like this, please subscribe. If there's anything you want me to talk about, please let me know. Thank you for watching.